Good morning. My name is Anna Marie Mallet, and we're here with Marc Yablonka, and we're at this SBTN in Orange County, California. It is August 1st, 2013, and please state your name.
Marc Yablonka.
And your date and place of birth.
April 10th, 1950, Los Angeles, California.
Can you describe for me your childhood and tell me about your family?
Sure. I would say that I basically had an average suburban upbringing, which is not to say that my folks weren't poor. I don't remember any poverty, but I know, for example, that when I came into this world, my parents tell me that which was at the Lincoln Clinic on Soto Street in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, they didn't quite have the money to pay for my birth, and the doctor said, "That's okay, you can pay me some other time." I really don't think that would happen today, though. My dad went to USC on the GI Bill and became an aeronautical engineer. While he was in school, he was a checker in the Safeway market, making $13 a week. My mother was a seamstress, but as the years went by, we got more and more comfortable, and so, as I say, I think my upbringing was basically your typical suburban upbringing, going to school, having friends, playing baseball, things of that nature.
Baseball, your favorite sport?
Still is to this day.
What's your favorite team?
Los Angeles Dodgers, of course. What kind of a question is that?
When did you develop a love for journalism, and when did you decide to be a journalist?
Actually, yes, it was accidental. I had already started a career teaching English as a second language with the adult division of the Los Angeles Unified School District back in 1975. Mm-hmm. And then 2 or 3 years later, I went to saw a film called The Killing Fields, which was about the Cambodian connection to the war in Indochina. And 2 double cognacs later, in the bar next to the theater, I decided that's what I wanted to be after seeing the exploits and the history of New York Times correspondent Sidney Schanberg and his Cambodian counterpart, Dith Pran, who I met many years later. I decided that's a career I wanted for myself as a secondary career, so I went back to community college, got an AA in journalism, and have been writing and taking some photographs ever since.
What year did you graduate?
With
your AA in journalism?
Oh gosh, 1987. Yeah.
And so, did you enjoy going to school for that? Or?
I did. I parlayed that experience into a master's degree. I got a master's in professional writing at USC. So, like my father before me, I became a Trojan, and it meant a lot to me and my career as a journalist to have gone there and to have honed my craft as a writer.
What year did you receive your master's?
1990. I was 40 years old.
Congratulations. What are your memories of the Vietnam War?
My memories of the war were from afar, as I did not serve in Vietnam at that time, but I can remember coming home from from a day at school, Villa Park High School here in Orange County. My history teacher, Gary Long, came in one day and he said, tomorrow we're going to have a debate about the war in Vietnam, and he said, "Mark, I want you to take the con side." And I remember coming home to my dad saying, "Dad, what's Vietnam?" And my dad sat down and educated me on, basically what was going on in Indochina. Both sides of the conflict was something that he, as an aeronautical engineer, had a stake in, because companies that he headed up had a lot of government contracts with weaponry, some of which was used in Vietnam.
So, in what ways did the Vietnam War affect you?
Well, as the years went on, as I got older in high school, of course, the Vietnam War was what we watched for dinner. The 6 o'clock news was replete with reports from the battlefield. I can remember very well Walter Cronkite's broadcast after he himself came back from Vietnam, after I believe it was the Tet Offensive in 1968, in which he basically opined that the best that the United States could hope for was a draw in Vietnam. And I remember his friend President Johnson saying, "If I've lost my friend Walter, then we may have lost the war." I remember President Johnson also saying in March of 1968 that he had decided not to seek another term as President of the United States.
At the time, what did you view as the cause of the Vietnam War? And has that view changed?
Well, ostensibly, of course, we went to Vietnam to fight the communist encroachment. I came up, in a household that, even though my father was in aeronautics and working with, contracts that, in a sense, supported the war, questioning the war and thinking that perhaps it was a conflict that we in our country shouldn't have gotten involved in, that it was a civil war. My views have changed tremendously since then. I now view it, having grown up and having met many people who were in Vietnam, having studied the war, having been in Indochina, with the opinion that it was a noble cause that we should have continued the fight for. And I'm saddened to this day that we didn't do so. I feel that we left some great people behind.
What were your feelings towards the war at the time?
What was my feelings towards the war? Well, I got into university, and I'm afraid that I was swept up in the anti-war movement, and I think blindly so. I think a lot of us were taken in a direction by people who used the anti-war protesters for their own gain. And as I analyze it today, so many years later, with the change of mind that I've gone through over the years, it's incongruous to me that the anti-war movement what it was. You had so many people with disparaging viewpoints. You had pacifists who were against all violence, and yet you had Black Panther Party people who were advocating the violent overthrow of our country. And to this day, I don't understand how that could all come together in one movement, but it did. And I have, for many years now, regretted that I allowed myself to become swept up in the thinking at the time.
So, do you feel the media covered both sides of the Vietnam War fairly? And if so, why or why not?
That's a difficult question for me to answer, because in the scope of the book that I've written, which is called Distant War, Recollections of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, I've interviewed many journalists who covered the war, and I've befriended many. My overall view is they had a difficult job to do, and they did it well. Could they have covered more of the atrocities that occurred on the part of America's adversaries? I believe yes, they could have. I don't subscribe to the theory, as many do, that the media lost the war in Vietnam. But I only wish, in retrospect, that we in the United States had more availability or more understanding that the communist encroachment into South Vietnam did the terrible things that it did to the Vietnamese people.
Atrocities that weren't covered, that some of the American enemies had done. Is there one in particular you're thinking of?
No, not in particular, but I have to ask, and I do ask myself, here in this country, a lot is made of the My Lai massacre. And a question that I often ask myself is how many My Lai massacres that were perpetrated on the part of the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army went unreported or underreported.
Do you feel the news was biased and underreported the good things GIs did for the Vietnamese? And if so, why or why not?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you feel the news was biased and underreported the good things GIs did for the Vietnamese? And if so, why or why not?
Let's put it this way. I feel that there could have been more coverage of good things, the building of schools, the med caps, our troops going in and inoculating villagers and such. And that only would have helped the image that our soldiers had.
Describe your feelings towards Vietnam veterans during the war, and have your feelings changed, and if so, how?
I've always respected the Vietnam veterans. I did then. I do so more now. One of the reasons why I feel such anger towards the protest movement is that because they allowed people, for example, to spit on our GIs when they came off the planes on those freedom birds. And I never would have allowed myself to do it. It was a disdainful act. And my respect over the years for the Vietnam veteran has grown as I've gotten older. And as it turns out, most of my friends of today were in Vietnam in in several different capacities, and so my respect, has grown immensely for them.
What are your thoughts on the anti-war movement during the war, and have your thoughts changed since the war?
Well, I think again that the young anti-war activists were impressionable. I think that they were led in some ways, I mean, I hate to say it, but they were led like sheep to a cause that ultimately used them and spit them out. Certain factions, for example, people who burned their draft cards as a protest. Several of the people who spearheaded that movement were well known. And as such, when they went to jail for having committed that federal crime of burning their draft cards, they got basically cush time. They were in jail for maybe a short period of time. They weren't mistreated. If they didn't want to get a haircut on haircut day, they said so, and the prison guards left them alone. But what about the people that were also led into these jails because they too burned their draft cards and were allowed to languish for years in prison? What about these people that led them there? Why didn't they speak up about that? To my knowledge, they never did.
Tell me about your book, Distant War: Recollections of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and what inspired you to write it?
Well, Distant War: Recollections of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia is basically a compilation of about 30 profiles of people that I have interviewed over a 25 year period for different publications such as the U.S. Military Stars and Stripes, American Veteran Magazine, which is the publication of the AMVETS Veterans Organization, for which I was a contributing writer for some 15 years. It is some people say an odd compilation because I think in my book I go where a lot of other books haven't gone. Yes, I have stories of grunts on the ground and pilots in the air, but I also endeavored in the course of my reportage, and this ended up in my book, to interview people on the periphery, the people who most often suffer from the war, the citizens. I have the famous Vietnamese actress Kieu Chin in my book, who's a beloved figure here in the Vietnamese community here in Little Saigon and all over the country. Pat Sajak, Wheel of Fortune, ABC TV game show host. Very few people know that he's a Vietnam veteran. His biggest audience, as he would tell you if he were here, was when he was on Armed Forces Radio Saigon. I interviewed donut dollies, the Red Cross workers who brought a little bit of home to the troops in the field. So it's kind of a strange and perhaps odd collection of people who experienced the war. In addition, I would add some of the journalists who covered the war in my book. Here in the Vietnamese community, Associated Press photographer Nick Ut is well known and beloved. He's in my book.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Well, again, it's a compilation of about 20 to 25 years of reportage. I can tell you this, it took probably the better part of a few months to assemble the book. It took the better part of a year and a half to get it published. A lot of publishers, even military publishers, were not initially interested in the book because the excuse I got was, well, this is just a bunch of articles. The task I had was basically to tie them together, the articles, with anecdotes, for example, of how the book came about. I mentioned Pat Sajak. I'll tell you a quick story about him. When I decided to interview him, when I found out he was had been a disc jockey at AFVN. He had been embroiled in a bit of a scandal because there was a contestant on his game show that had won a lot of money, and Pat was so happy for him he went to hug him, and the guy turned around and sued Pat for bodily injury. So the day of our appointed interview came, and Pat called me on the phone and he said, "Let's see, Mark, what are we supposed to be talking about?" And I said, "Pat, don't worry, I'm not going to sue you." And what was supposed to be a 15-minute interview ended up that he and I talked on the phone for about an hour. Very nice man.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Can you describe the feelings of Vietnam veterans during the war, and have their feelings changed since the war?
Right. I don't want to be the one to speak for Vietnam veterans, because I'm not one. I was only in Vietnam after the war, several times and several years later as a reporter for some of these publications. But they run the gamut. I have, among my friends who are Vietnam veterans, I have friends who had horrific experiences who wouldn't deem of going back to Vietnam, and I have friends who to this day go back every year to get involved in projects, for example, building schools, Agent Orange related projects. So it's really something that I can't pigeonhole into one. I think you'd have to talk to basically every Vietnam veteran out there to get the feeling for how they felt about their war experiences. I can tell you this, that as the years have gone on, it's become important for us, and I think Iraq and Afghanistan have taught us this, to recognize our Vietnam veterans, albeit belatedly. I think the wall in Washington did a lot to heal that wound. And now, speaking for myself, if I'm driving down the road and I see a car drive by with a Vietnam service ribbon on the back fender, I'll wave and I'll say thank you.
Describe your experiences with Vietnamese and/or Vietnamese Americans during and after the Vietnam War.
My connection to, or my experiences with the Vietnamese people really took up after the war was over. I didn't know any Vietnamese people during the Vietnam War because, as you're aware, they basically came after April 30th, 1975, when Saigon fell. A few months after that, I took a job teaching English as a second language in Los Angeles, and one very endearing experience happened to me. I had a Vietnamese grandmother in my class. I'll never forget her name. Her name was Lam. And Lam worked in a photo shop in Chinatown. And during coffee break time, she came up to my desk and she said, "Teacher, I understand this word," and it was the verb to leave. At that time, I'd done a little bit of research into Vietnam, and I knew that the older generation, many of them spoke French. So I said, "Mrs. Lam, parlez-vous français?" She said, "Oui." I said, "Leave, c'est la même chose de partir." And she lit up like a Christmas tree, dancing around the room. "Our teacher speaks French, our teacher speaks French." Every Thursday night, which was the last night of classes, for 3 months, Lam would come with a shopping bag full of cha yo, the Vietnamese egg rolls. And I'm telling you, for 3 months, I never had to cook dinner. And this was, to me, this was the heart and the soul of the Vietnamese people that I have come to know over the years. Wonderful, caring people who have really endeavored to fit into our American way of life.
Have you been to Vietnam?
Been to Vietnam 3 times. The first time I was there was 1990. I had finished up my master's thesis at USC, which was actually on CNN, was involved with a group called the Friends of Children of Vietnam during the war. They were involved in the baby lifts, flying orphans out of Vietnam as Saigon was falling. So I got the chance to interview her in 1990 in Saigon. I remember when I first got there and hopped on my first cyclo, I felt as if I was in the center of the universe in Saigon, albeit a very foreboding center of the universe, because that was only a short 15 years after Vietnam, after the war had ended, after Saigon had fell, and you were met with certain suspicion. That suspicion sort of continued 2 years later when I was in North Vietnam, in Hanoi. I was invited by a program that was spearheaded at the University of Wisconsin to go to Vietnam and lecture about the use of American English at the Hanoi University for Teachers of Foreign Languages. That's when I came away observing the poverty that Hanoi was then, cloaked in, and the salaries that, for example, English teachers had to subsist on, with the sentiment that in reality, I don't believe the United States lost the Vietnam War. I think we won it. And I think, if anything, communism destroyed Vietnam at that time.
Describe for me your decision to join the military and your career as a military journalist.
Sure. That took up basically after 9/11. I was looking around for some way that I could serve my country. I had not served in Vietnam, which, in a lot of ways is what my book is about too, in some ways making up for it by telling the stories of people who did serve in Vietnam. 9/11 happened, and I was looking around for something I could do, and I got a call from a friend of mine, Jim Kakavo, who had been in Vietnam with the Red Cross and had also done some reporting and photographing for Newsweek magazine, who was a troop in the California State Military Reserve down the road at the Joint Forces Training Base in Los Alamitos. Jim said we'd need public affairs officers. I said, Jim, what are you talking about? I'm 50 years old. That was 13 years ago. And he said, doesn't matter in our unit. And that led to a career of 8 years of basically photographing and writing stories about our troops who were mobilizing and demobilizing to and from Iraq and Afghanistan, something that I was very proud to have been able to do in that amount of time.
Is there anything you would like to add or say? Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish I would have asked you?
Two things come to mind. I just want to say that in my heart and my mind, I've worked with minorities and immigrants from all over the world. To me, the Vietnamese are the people who have come here and pitched in extraordinarily so to make this country as great as it is. And to my friends who served in Vietnam and to every Vietnam veteran, I want to say welcome home and thank you for your service.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Yablonka, and it's been an absolute honor and pleasure to have you here. And
Thank you.
so
My
much.
pleasure. My honor.